So with me today we have Charlie, Cheever, CEO of Expo. We have Marcin, CEO of Self-Mention, Jessica from Chime, Nicola from Meta, Lorenzo from Microsoft, and Monica from Shopify. So we had some questions prepared, so we've been asking you to submit your questions on Twitter. And there were quite a few questions being asked. Some of them were like a little bit too technical, I think, for the panel, and some of them have like a definitive answer, so it's better if those are actually being answered in text on Twitter directly. So if someone feels like answering, then just feel free to check out the questions from Twitter. And I picked some of those questions, going to be asking them to this group of panelists. So the first question was from Mark, and yeah, I'll just read it so that I don't change the context. So with multiple speakers talking about apps that run on native and web, it's clearly a trending topic among the community. How do the panelists feel about this uptick in community interest and how it is being viewed at their respective companies? Whoever likes answering, Jessica. This is very far
I can take a stab at this one a little bit. So at least over at Chime, like, we do value web. Like, there's a lot of use cases for web still. On our end, like, ideally, we want to kind of prioritize development velocity, but also prioritize like our member experience for kind of customizations depending on their platform. So you can imagine like web interfaces and features might be very different from mobile interfaces and features. So I think it is going to be a trade-off of like, for us, like the development velocity with how many features you can customize. One other thing is that right now for us, our mobile app is like much more mature than our web app. So it's a little bit different from starting from scratch. So starting from scratch, it'll be a lot easier, kind of building one universal app for everything. For us, we need to figure out like where along the spectrum we live there.
Anyone wants to chime in?
Yeah, I actually didn't hear the end of the question, but I gathered it was about web and React Native. And it's so clear that this is like the theme of this edition of this conference. It's like 4 or 5 of the talks are about it. All kinds of people are embracing this and checking it out. I think it'll take a bit of time before this stuff matures for a couple of reasons. One is, like Jessica was saying, when you've already started on a path where you've got your mobile app separate from your web app and one's more mature than the other, that's hard. It's much easier to start from the beginning with a single code base if we want to end up there. And then there's a bunch of problems in terms of navigation and styling and specifying, dealing with the differences between web and what iOS and Android give you. But people really do want this, and I think like the community is going to come together and figure out how to fill in all these gaps. And I bet in the next 18 months, 2 years, we're going to see really good solutions to this, and it's going to become very normal that everybody will just want to do this. I think the biggest missing piece of a lot of this stuff is just sort of like making it super, super easy to do this so that it's just like the normal default thing for everybody. And we're very close to there, but that's probably what it'll take to get that momentum turning into like a big snowball that keeps rolling.
Yeah, I think it was really interesting questions, and we've also noticed that when receiving the submissions for the talks for the conference, so many people, many talks were featured on the conference, but many were rejected eventually. But yeah, that's definitely. Can we ask someone to bump up the speakers on the sides, because we cannot really hear what we are talking about? Is it better? No? Yeah, there are speakers over there, should work. Maybe we can rotate that one. Can we have someone here help with the sound on the stage? Because we are not hearing anything this side. I mean, this one works, but it's only with me.
We can keep going.
Yeah, let's keep going. Might be better now? Yeah, I think so. Is it better? Yeah. Great. Thank you so much. So the second question I also really liked from Marek. If you had to choose one thing you'd like to see to be improved or added to React Native, what would it be?
Thank you. Definitely no bias about my answer, but I think that it definitely has to be some improvement to flat lists and just lists in general, but nothing to do with anything that I talked about during my conference. But yeah, I think it's just like one of the things that we have been suffering the most as developers when using React Native specifically. So there is even though we've been working on it, like the team at Meta and React Native overall and contributors and everything have worked in improving it, it still has, like a long road to go in order to like be up to the user needs and developer needs.
Yeah, kind of tagging along on what Monica said. I was just chatting with Bartek, one of our teammates who works on like our pay friends screen where we load contact lists from members' like devices. We actually got a report from, like a bug report from our CEO of, hey, like I'm trying to load the contact list, it's incredibly slow. I guess after the team investigated, turns out he had, I think, over 10,000 or 9,000 contacts on his phone. So you can imagine if you're trying to search for a contact, load it, like it's incredibly slow. So I'm incredibly excited also like instead of porting like with our contact loader, like the thousands of contacts over the bridge, excited for like JSI coming in and making that a little bit more efficient for performance improvements. Though we did improve his contact list loading since, it's just we had to do some stuff under the hood.
Any other ideas from the panelists?
Yeah, I was thinking maybe in more like, I guess, literal sense, like I would have loved for React Native, the core library to have also navigation library integrated within it. Like, I'm super like appreciative of the fact that the community came up with so many different approaches, but it should be a problem solved at the root. So it would be great for core to have its own navigation library integrated.
Yeah, I'm going to add a thing. It's more like on the community side of things. I think we all should do a better job in terms of storytelling. I feel like when I come at conferences like this, I hear about stories of apps developed with React Native and how you made it successful. But like in the whole ecosystem of the IT world, we can definitely do a better job, especially like big companies, like every one of us. I don't want to name any company, but I think we can like tell a better story of how we are using React Native and how it's making a product successful. Because at the end of the day, there are so many apps that we use daily that are running on React Native. And I learned that they use React Native because I met the developer that are developing it. But without knowing the developer, I would have not been aware of that. So I think there is space for everyone to improve and learn on this.
Great. Anyone else? Anything to add? Charlie?
One thing I would throw in here is just a really strong debugging story that's like native. Just looking over at the world of the web and just thinking about like the Chrome dev tools and like the richness you can get there in terms of just like plugging into the JSVM, a REPL, network requests, inspecting and things like that. I think like all those things are kind of possible in React Native right now, but it's just not like great. And I think that would really help people who are doing complicated things and just help developers move faster.
Okay. I was said a couple of great answers. Let's move then to the next question, Jerry. We have a question from Sebastian. Server-driven UI seems to be growing in large companies' apps for flexibility and scalability reasons. Any thoughts on adding a server-side solution to React Native or Expo? Can React Native server components make any sense? When wants to? Yeah, Jessica, leaning in.
I don't have a response for the question, but I can just say that like at Chime, like server-driven UI is incredibly important for us. Given that we're a bank, like we often have a lot of like compliance and like regulatory changes that we'll need to make on the fly. I think for us, like fast iteration changes are incredibly important, and being able to do a lot of dynamic experiments to figure out like, hey, what member experience is better, what flow is better, like being able to design and like make changes quickly there is important for us.
That's a good answer.
Just coming at it from the Expo angle, I think you could implement this now with the stuff out there if you wanted this. I've seen some experiments on GitHub and whatnot where people have played around with this. I think you want it less in the context of a mobile app because oftentimes you're dealing with like weak internet connections that are just going in and out. That's just the nature of running around on mobile devices. And then also the expectations for responsiveness and latency and things like that are just higher on mobile devices. Like people expect to be able to unlock their phone and get into Twitter or Instagram or whatever app they have like almost instantly. And they tend to have more patience when they're loading a website and things like that. So I think the demand is going to be a little bit less, but there's no reason this shouldn't be an option, especially for products that have huge, wide, changing surface area where, yeah, you do want to load in things on demand that are completely different than previous stuff you'd had. I think that this doesn't necessarily need to be implemented at the React Native or Expo layer of stuff. I think it actually be already done in like application layer, user land. And I actually think even if you wanted to pull it down into the Expo layer or the React Native layer, it should be like, you should do it in user land first and create like exactly what you want before it sort of gets optimized by being pulled down into the stack. Because there's few things worse than like taking an incorrect thing or a slightly off abstraction and sort of baking it into the core that can only be changed slowly or is very hard to change.
Actually, saying other questions by Sebastian, I think this one was kind of inspired by the fact that like what oftentimes happens with mobile apps in general, but also like React Native apps, is that you interleave the native experience with web views just because you cannot really build everything into your app, and some screens are just not visited that often, so that you just like rely on displaying web view-based content. So potentially, like React Native seems to be better suited for the kind of like server-rendered content needs. But yeah, that's I think what inspired the question. So if you have anything to add here, then we can continue to the next question. All right, next question is about open source. Many of you represent companies that make big contributions to open source. How you make this work in your organizations? What the benefits are from your perspective, and how to find the right balance between open source and product work? So you want to pick it up?
Okay, maybe I'll start. So at Software Mention, we right now, I would say we probably spend about between 25 and 35% of time on different kinds of developer tools, most of them obviously open source. And I think if you are a product company, you will build a solution to a problem, then you have the problem solved, and you probably, well, there is not that much incentive to open source, or like, why would you do that if you can instead spend time on building features, move your product forward? But if you're an agency, you are solving the same problems again and again for different clients. So this gives a lot of inspiration and a lot of feedback, what could be improved in the tools, what should be built, what is the problem, and you see that again and again at different projects. So this actually very much helps building good open source software, but it also works the other way around. Like for us, the model of building great open source software, it's obviously, it gives us a lot of visibility, which obviously gives us new clients, new opportunities in terms of earning money, and kind of finance that back. And this loop is, I think, okay, it works for us. So I would say this is pretty good loop. Yep.
Yeah, I think I want to share a bit like how at Microsoft we're doing open source. I think because maybe surprisingly, like I really feel we're still learning a lot. And the key word in there is like leading by example. So when you ask like, oh, are you doing open source in a big organization? For me, the answer is like, well, there are multiple people in multiple sides of the company that are really passionate about open source. They lead by example. They drive the idea of like, we should be open source first. And then that energy trickles to their colleagues, to the rest of their team, and you establish new practices. So all of a sudden, instead of like, oh, I'll just default to do a private fork of this library, instead I'll submit a PR upstream and I'll collaborate with the maintainer. So there's a lot there in you know, you really need to ingrain in your culture that like open source is not like free as in free beer, but like as in free puppies. Like if you pick up a puppy from like a box and you take it home, it's not like, okay, now he's gonna live on its own, right? You need to feed him, you need to clean after him, and you need to stick around it, right? So that's a very important and challenging cultural shift that some companies need to do. And aside from that, I think at Microsoft we also see this as an opportunity to really give back, because we're really trying to make things better for everyone. Like, if I remember correctly, like our motto is basically that we want to empower everyone to do the best that they can. So like open source is a really good way to achieve that. And yeah, I think it's something that we can all learn a lot. And I think the talk you did yesterday about how Shopify does open source was really, I hope, inspiring for a lot of people here on like how they should do that more, basically.
Yeah, just to like complement what you were saying, I think at least at Shopify, yes, we recognize that it's not always possible to keep a balance between like doing work like for our products and also open sourcing everything. But we try to come from the idea of like, first, if we have a need of something that needs to be improved for us and our products, we can start working on it, and then bring it back to the community when it's possible, right? So like the distribution, I guess, of how it works would be around like 80% of the time we have to commit to our products and just be working, but then we have around 20% that we do want to give back, and then just we want to commit to fix things that are not only useful for us, but also for like the community in general. And it goes from also the passion that we feel about like developing and just using React Native in this case, or the technologies that we do.
Yeah, I want to add a couple of things on what Lorenzo said, and I think for us the biggest challenge is all about the cultural shift, because you literally, especially when you're like working in big orgs, you basically create your own world internally. Like you have your own tools that work a little bit different than how they work outside, and so on. And the amount of engineers that works on React and React Native is quite big. And we try to make processes that prioritize the open source environment as much as possible. We try to avoid shortcuts, because it's always easy, you know, like you're inside a company, you need to ship a change, you just make an internal CI green and you push it, and that lands on GitHub and breaks the rest of the world. So we are literally, like, there is an ongoing effort in putting the open source ecosystem first, so that we don't make mistakes as we probably did in the past. Maybe some of you sent pull requests on React Native that they got forgotten in the past. And I apologize on behalf of my team if this happened. But we are really trying to make this sustainable. We can't rely on single person. Like, we can't rely on that developer that is passionate about open source and is looking at all the APRs. We're trying to make processes that lives across years, across people changing, across managers changing. So it's a matter of, again, as Lorenzo said, cultural shift. Like, people need to understand why we're doing certain things, why we want to keep a project alive, and where do we invest.
We ran out of answers. Yeah, that was very insightful. Next question is about Expo. The Expo has historically been seen as a tool for building prototypes or learning React Native. But it's made a huge progress in the past years, and now provides us far superior developer experience compared to plain React Native. What are your thoughts now on using Expo, and would it make sense for your organizations to adapt it? Pick it up. Lorenzo.
Okay, I can give the
Saving
others
the day.
sometimes to think. What can I say? From the Microsoft perspective, I don't think we have an official answer. We surely look at Expo as something like we can learn a lot from, and like we aspire like to shape the React Native experience into something like what Expo is doing. So in that sense, yes, we recognize a lot like how good Expo is right now. And yeah, I don't know of scenarios in which we are or we want to be using Expo, but I think there's an entire pool of developers that like I don't see a future in which like people don't consider Expo like at least like 60% of the time. Like whenever they need to do cross-platform and they choose like React Native or JavaScript based, like Expo should really be on the forefront because it's such a complete experience. So I don't know, maybe in smaller companies you're even thinking of, I don't know, white labeling or using Expo for some other things, I don't know. What about consultancies? Are you suggesting Expo?
I can tell that for us, Expo, we can use Expo and we use a lot. It's easier if you're working with, well, with different projects that are actually starting, not having a big organization that you would have to, well, start using Expo with an existing app. It's the answer to the original question for me was like we're already using it, and I think this works. But yeah, I am not sure when was the first time we've built an app with Expo for a client. Probably, I don't know, 4 years ago, maybe even more. And back then it was when we talked to someone about the technology choices, it was like Expo was an option, but then you had to ask all those questions like, will you ever need native code, or will you? Are there any different kinds of things that can stop you from using Expo? And usually the answer would be, yeah, possibly. And as the years went by, the problems got away. Like each problem would be less more often happening. And now I would say probably like in 80% of cases, we would probably say, yeah, Expo should be the best way to move forward.
All right. So we have another question from Sanket also about Expo. With the latest advancement with Expo, pre-build and no eject, can we assume that Expo and core React Native are diverging from each other? A bit. Charlie, what do you say?
I would actually say like the opposite in a lot of ways, where I think we've just noticed that people just don't want to make a big choice between using Expo and using React Native or something like that. Like they don't like forks in the road. And for good reason. Like you don't know what things you're going to need in the future. You don't know what requirements you're going to have. And so we've actually been pretty deliberate and pretty like conscious about like trying to make it so that we're tracking closer to React Native and that you can kind of pick and choose what you want and not really, like, the last question was kind of about like this, you know, sometimes companies face a choice, should I use Expo or not use Expo? And we kind of want, like, one way we could try to answer that question is say, all right, we have to do everything we can do to get people to choose Expo, but we also almost want to make it so that question goes away and you don't even really have this big choice. And it's because, like, yeah, you're just using React Native the same way you would, and you're picking and choosing the tools that Expo gives you if you want them. But you don't need to use them, and it's not a big deal. You can change your mind later in a big way. So I think you can expect to see us mostly hew pretty close to React Native, and it should feel very much like you're getting directly plugged into React Native when you want that.
I also remember Expo, like, some years ago, just actually having like a fork of React Native and having like a number of patches that were on top of that. So what's the situation with it? Is it still there?
There are a couple of patches.
Because I remember some of those like things just going away eventually. And
yeah, most of those patches are because we cram a couple different versions of React Native into Expo Go. The reason for that is just so that if you're working on a project and a new, SDK comes out, you don't want it to be broke. You don't want to be paralyzed and unable to develop it the next day just because there's a new version out. So we put a couple of versions in there all at once. and we need to do a little bit of patching to do that, but we've tried to keep making that fork skinnier and skinnier and just track much more closely to the upstream. And ideally, we would have it just go away completely.
To follow up on what, like the current answer. I mean, one of the things that we heard a lot in the last years was that upgrading React Native was a pain. I guess like some of you might share that feeling. So actually, a lot of the work that we did recently as part of the React Native team was like looking into the release process and trying to understand what are the pain points. And I'm glad, like I spoke with folks at Expo and they mentioned that like, now it's way easier to like bring up the framework up to the latest release of React Native. So I don't feel that the divergence is so prominent. And on that sense, like if the question is, should I use React Native CLI or should I use Expo? Well, on our end, we don't have a real answer. The general answer that we give is like, use the tool that works best for you. At Meta, we have like a strong culture of basically developing UI frameworks and core capabilities like rendering and native integrations. We don't focus that much on developer experience, mostly because internally, as I said before, we have our own environment with our own set of tools, which are sadly not open sourceable and like will not even make much sense to open source them. So whoever is developing tool on top of our framework, we are more than welcome to support them. And this was one problem. Like, for example, the feedback loop in addressing issues that other tools that were building on top of us was extremely slow. We looked into that, and we tried to make the word for others as better as possible. So, again, CLI or Expo, use whatever works best for you. Let us know if there is something missing in the framework, which is making one of your tools that you are developing harder to develop, and we will try to see what we can do and how we can simplify that workflow.
Thank you. Next question is really short, but I know that some of you have a lot of thoughts about that. What can React Native learn from Flutter?
No, okay. I'll start here, but I also want to hear other opinions on this. I want to start by saying that I knew that the question about Flutter was coming, but because it's a classic. And why is that? Because there's a lot of, how can we phrase it? Like, whenever one comes up in the conversation, the other one follows up. And there's a lot of like competition going on. Like we all remember the framework JS wars between Angular and React. So we're kind of used into the mindset of like different frameworks, like really competing aggressively against each other. And like having these two teams of people, and like if yours works one team, you hate everyone on the other team. And the first thing I want to say about that is I really want to break that. Like I don't think Flutter is necessarily evil. I don't think that everyone is using Flutter is a bad person. Absolutely. I think we have a lot that we can learn from it, and that's why I love this question. And for example, I think that Flutter has shown clearly how much like developer relationship and like having great documentation, having videos in your documentation, having examples that are always well maintained, caring about like even your social media presence and those kind of things. Like those are really things that make the developers, so your quote-unquote consumers, like feel that they're, cared of. Like there's a lot there and that consistency of Flutter, of like really showing up for their users, it's what I feel like allowed them to really like skyrocket in terms of popularity lately with like their GitHub stars. I don't think in terms of adoption can as easily like go as fast up because of technical divergences from something like JavaScript-based like React Native. But I think in particular there's a lot there that we can learn in like how the product is perceived by the consumers and how the consumers feel like that they are cared of, and like how documentation can really lead the project to success.
One wants to add anything to this question about Flutter? Right. All right. So next question, going back to React Native world. What is one thing in React Native? It could be a feature, library, anything really, that may not be very well known, but you're very excited about it. Something that's not too popular.
I don't know if we're just ready to pilot yet, but definitely excited about that new architecture. I think all the performance improvements it could provide. We have a lot of folks who are on lower end devices. We'll see a good number of out of memory issues that come up. So just excited for that to come out. Or it is out, but just to be integrated.
No one has answered to that, and maybe I can mention one thing. Because
I can add a super small thing. This is probably almost well known actually. Like in the core React Native repo, there's a thing called RN tester. It's a folder. It's also like a test app that it's basically what Facebook uses to validate that all the components work well. But the great thing about it, and I think we should figure out a way to make it more prominent, like each one of these like sub pages of this test app where they literally test everything for the component. So like if you need to learn how a component can be used in like all the possible ways, you should just open RN tester, go see the source code for that component specifically, and it's much more comprehensive than the documentation actually. So that's like my hidden treasure. Whenever I don't know something, I just go there, see the component in action there. But yeah, that's a really cool one.
Right. We had some talks about the new architecture, and we also just mentioned it. So the question is, how do you envision Fabric adoption across the community? What do you expect from Fabric, and what do you think is necessary for your organizations to consider adopting it in the apps you build?
But I promise I will not answer the next one. So I'm actually prepared to talk about this because at Microsoft, like, of course, with our scale, like something like migrating to an entire new architecture becomes like, oh, how many months, how many people do we need to get involved into this? As also like the talk earlier today from the guys from Software Mention was saying, like, Fabric and the new architecture in general requires a lot of work from the entire community. So personally, I think it's going to be a long process. I don't think that the backward compatibility that Nicola mentioned in a tweet yesterday is going to go away in like 6 months. It's probably going to stay around for a really long time. And basically, like, if you think about it, the new architecture, like Facebook took you 3 years, right? And you were able to basically do it while, like, you were fixing a machine while you were on it. So, like, you were only one commit away from fixing a problem. Like, if you were moving to the new architecture into a screen and something was broken, you could just, like, do the commit and automatically you would get the fix. But, like, everyone else is going to have to do that through new releases. So it's going to be a software feedback loop. So that's probably going to take, I don't know. I would hope that, like, in 2 years, we're all happy with our existing app to the new architecture, or maybe we just like rewrite everything in the new architecture directly. Maybe that's faster. But yeah, I think it's going to be a long process. I think we all need to be aware that it requires some costs. I think that the talk the Software Mention guys did earlier was a really great primer for that. And yeah, I'll also be doing my own talk at some point later in the future. So I'll tell you more then.
Yeah, I can add to this. As Lorenzo said, it took us several years, so I can't expect to come here and say, like, 6 months, done. Obviously, it will take quite a bit of time for the open source community. We are not pushing hard. As you saw, I haven't given any dates that we are saying, like, hey, we're going to drop support for the old architecture in 6 months, 12 months. This is not happening as of today, but please take your time, start looking into this kind of stuff. We are really focusing a lot of our attention on library authors because those are the key to unblock the old migration for the community. Like, ideally, if once you develop an app and all of your libraries are migrated, you should just be fine by enabling the new architecture, and it should be good to go. Again, we will be releasing more content, like updated guides and documentation on how to properly write a component or a module which are fully backward compatible. And we are constantly looking into the process. Like we literally look at daily, weekly at our documentation, and we try to understand like, okay, in this guide that contains 12 steps, which one I can realistically remove if I develop like a script, part of the code gen that will simplify some of those steps. So we are trying to streamline this as much as possible. And actually want to thank all the libraries that already started migrating or already like released new versions which are like compatible with Fabric and Turbo modules. But again, like if you have feedback, please share it on the working group, on Twitter, on GitHub issues, wherever. Like we are actively looking at those, and yeah, we will be more than happy to hear what doesn't work for you and so on.
Yeah, I think the community like only needs like just a little push, and before the new like apps start appearing that works on Fabric, and then like people start observing what kind of actually benefits come with it, and that might actually bring all sorts of people who will be then not really waiting for all the dependencies to be supporting Fabric, but maybe just think of some other ways how to replace some of the dependencies they have. So this might actually go that way. Yeah. Thank you for the answer. So yeah, I have only one last question to ask, and the question is about the future, and the future App.js conference actually. Are you coming? I actually have one more question, sorry. But it's also about the App.js conference. So what's the next thing for React Native? What type of topics you think we'll talk about on the next App.js conference that you will come to? What's the future of React Native?
This one.
Yeah.
This is more like my personal point of view on the thing. I don't have much to share from Meta's side other than what we already said. But I'm a big fan of like new platforms, new surfaces. So I haven't seen a talk about like, for example, React Native on foldable devices. Has someone looked into that? What's the situation? Or like wearable devices? What can we do today with this framework? And beyond that, like Skia support. Has anyone looked into rendering React on a console application? Like I'm a big fan of those like new surfaces where you can bring this framework. And so yeah, I'll be looking forward to see more on this space.
Yeah, I mean, definitely the theme of this edition of App.js was sort of like web and one code base across everything. And I think that leads into what might be the next big theme, which I think might be about like distribution and like when you make something, how do you get it to somebody else as quickly as possible? Like for internal testing, for using, for everything like that. And even going back to like an earlier question you were asking about server-side components and rendering stuff on the server and sending it down live. That's kind of part of the same question, which is sort of like, oh, like I have new stuff that I need to send to people like without, going through all kinds of processes and approvals and bureaucratic stuff to get to somebody else. And so just finding ways to improve the efficiency and speed and reduce the friction of distribution, I think, is actually sort of orthogonal to React Native, but so important to its success that I think it might end up being a pretty big theme of the next year or two.
So you're Marcin reaching for the mic there.
I hope the next App.js will be more about more platforms again. I would love seeing React Native to become a kind of a default way to build UIs for new platforms, so that if you have a platform that is not Android or iOS, then you probably start with building React Native UI for that. Well, we are doing one project like that, so hopefully we can talk about that next year. We'll see. Krzysztof, how do we? Hopefully, yeah.
Anything.
So yeah, I hope this will be the direction of React Native moving forward.
That's a great vision for the future, and that was our question. Last question for it.
I can add some more.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the first one is more of a like wishful thinking kind of scenario. I would love to see on stage like a talk by someone not from Microsoft, but like a talk about using the tooling that we've been releasing lately, like the App.js. Now we've been doing a lot of work in TypeScript. We are doing work with the Metro plugins and also, you know, React Native test app. Like for example, we've migrated WebView to have a React Native test app inside instead of a normal example app. So for us, it would be awesome to see like a more organic adoption in the community, someone coming up on stage next to him like, they were actually right or something over there. No, but aside from that, I really think that an area that is now in the early phases, I feel like, is Metro. Like lately, the work of Moti and Rob from Meta, Evan, like he mentioned yesterday during the keynote, Adam Foxman from our team, like they've been doing a lot of interesting things in modifying Metro so they can be expanded and tweaked and changed, and that opens the door to a lot of possibilities like the ES-Build plugin that we made a while back. Like I feel that Metro is a great place where things can be like still explored a lot, and now there's a renewed energy also on the meta side in collaborating and being open and, you know, modifying the source code. So yeah, and also like we had things like the Airbnb article of them using Metro on web in a very almost kind of secret way. Like they explained the technique, the theoretical ways they did it, but it's not really practical. But you know, there's a lot of opportunities there, and I think it would be great to hear more like people sharing their experience with like customizing Metro.
Thank you. So with this vision for next year, we can finish the panel for today. So give a round of applause for our panelists, for coming and presenting. Thanks for sticking around.